to introduce James Ojascastro. We have worked together for 1 year now, and he's going to talk about fiber optics, how representing ethnobotanical approaches to document artisanal papermaking traditions. So thank you, James.
Thanks, Cekouat. Thanks all you all for coming. Okay, so many of us are academics. We spend a lot of time reading papers and then writing papers. But who do we get to blame for this lovely tradition? Well, this guy. Cai Lun, he lived about 2,000 years ago in Han, China, and he noticed that all plants are made out of these cellulose fibers. And so if you found a way to either physically or chemically pulp them, macerate them, and then cast them on a screen such that the water can drain, mix them with water, and then let it dry completely, you are able to make this laminar sheet of cellulose that is useful for writing. But what's interesting is that Cai Lun lived during the early 1st century AD, and yet we found examples of paper through archaeological digs from before his time. In addition, von Hagen, who is an archaeologist from Germany who did work in Mexico, posited that paper is actually a descendant of non-woven textiles like bark cloth. And so first, this kind of material was first woven or first worn and then used as a way of recording knowledge. And the way that we know this is that we found stone tools that have been incised on the bottom because these have been used and are still used today for beating those fibers. So this is very interesting because now we're forced into a position where we have to discern the difference between, say, pulp fact and pulp fiction. So say we take this story about Cai Lun to be true. We do know and have compelling evidence that paper first started in Eastern China, and then over the centuries gradually spread from China to Japan, Korea, Central Asia, Vietnam, and eventually to Europe and coastal Africa. And so in doing so, not all plants live in the same place, and so people have co-opted more or less the same technique or allied techniques and tailored them to whatever indigenous flora that they have in their region. Okay, so what's interesting is that we have 300,000 or 400,000 species of plants, and so artisans around the world have chosen some particular subset of them. So how do we know what plants make good and durable paper? And so for this, I'm going to need a volunteer from the audience. So Boris, can you read that? So what's going on?
No, I cannot.
Okay, so why are you unable to break it? It's the fibers. The fibers are really long and really strong. Okay, one more. Don't go away yet. So I'm going to get this started for you. Try and peel this all the way. And so if you hold that up, you can peel the rest of it. So what we're seeing here in the macro level is a manifestation of, at the micro level, the very long, strong, and flexible cellulosic fibers that are in the phloem of this plant. Thanks, Boris. Okay, so it's actually growing behind this building. So go look at it. Okay, so in different countries, they have chosen these respective plants, and they make paper that lasts hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we can conclusively say that this is some serious gourmet paper. So how many species are actually used for traditional paper making? And this is kind of difficult to ascertain because there's some confusion in different ways of assessing knowledge. So we have documentation by historians who have written books and traveled to these different places, interviewed paper makers, and we also have botanists. And so what historians and ethnographers have done is taken copious photos, and I have followed up on some of those publications and found that in many cases, the traditions have been very conserved. They're doing procedures that they've done for thousands or hundreds of years. In botany, we have flora that provide blurbs that say this species or that species is used for making paper. And where does this come from? This comes from herbarium samples, for example. And so what's interesting is that this particular specimen, communicated by Dr. Nathaniel Wallach, includes an example of Lokta paper from Nepal that he wrote on and was put on the herbarium specimen with the plant used to make it. On top of that, we found, I think it was Aurora. Aurora found this particular herbarium sheet that just included an envelope. And in that envelope is a sheet of Tibetan paper that was used to dry plants that were collected there about 70 years ago. So, given this amount of evidence, it's no surprise that both botanists and historians have found agreement in what plants are used to make paper in the Himalayas. In Vietnam, this is a different story. The paper there is used to make these woodblock prints. More recently, it's been co-opted for origami. But there's not as much correspondence in understanding exactly what species is used. And a lot of that has been because of war that has happened in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula for the last, much of the last century. And what's interesting is that this historian of paper, Dart Hunter, he actually never went to the places where this plant was harvested. He actually is sourcing this from a document from the UK, and he claims that it's the same species as used in Nepal. And what has been found is that it's actually a different species, related but different, but they're all called zaw. So he notes that the kaizal, the zaw tree, the cultivated Daphne, so he got the common name, but it took a lot of evidence and a lot of interviews with the people in Vietnam to find out actually there's different kinds of zaw. There's the main zaw tree, but there's zaw liet, zaw cham, and several others. What's also interesting is that you can't just focus on the fiber, right? You have very specific plants used for very specific purposes in the processing of plants into paper. So ignore my really lovely footwear, but here's a fiber. The mallet is used from a very hard wood like guava. Once the fiber is pulped, the fiber here again is paper mulberry, but you have to add a mucilage to thicken the slurry so that you have time to distribute it on a screen. This comes from a particular malvaceous species. It's a vine. And then the vat, this one is 300 years old, dug out from a massive trunk of this Nguyen tree. In another part of northern Vietnam, this Zhao woman is dipping into a vat filled with a bamboo and a kiwi for the formation aid. And you need a very tight-grained wood to form the sheets because the wood is going to warp in water. And so she's using a rosewood, indigenous to Indochina. So what this is saying is that despite historians' work and botanical work, we need information from the artisans because they have knowledge that they have refined over many decades in their work. So what do we do in situations where we don't have physical evidence? So I'm going to turn back to the bark cloth that I mentioned in the first slide or two. Benton Pang, for his master's thesis, collected histories of people who have interviewed native Hawaiians and said, oh, we use this plant or we use that plant for kapa or bark cloth. And so here are the histories, here are the plants, but in some cases, we don't have the artisans. In fact, making bark cloth in Hawaii died out in the early 1900s and was only recently revived in around 1970. And so what Dr. Izzy Abbott at the University of Hawaii did is she became an artisan. And what she did is she's looking at some of these histories and wondering, well, if we have no evidence of Hawaiian raspberry paper, can we actually make some? No. So she tried beating the stems of this plant and they do not felt into fabric. And this is kind of an issue because we have an undervaluation of artisanal ecological knowledge. It takes so much time, so much effort to train and learn very minute details that have considerable impacts on the resulting paper or whatever trade or craft is practiced in that area. And so with globalization and capitalism being what it is and spreading around the world, we see very precipitous declines in the practices of these traditions. And I think this is summarized very well in the philosophy of an artisan interviewed by this papermaker, Amy Lee. A real secret is something you can share with the world because no one would figure it out on their own, even if you showed it to them and did it right in front of them. To master a craft, you need to be so good that people are nowhere close to following you. And I say this not to be egotistical, but I say this to emphasize the amount of time and diligence you have to dedicate your life to a tradition. So it's important that we have young people learning how to make these crafts, to carry on these traditions, both within the countries where they are indigenous to, but also outside. And so here we see a young boy in San Pablito who is carrying on the tradition of making a mate. And here is Veronica Pham, who is a paper maker at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who I've been working with to document and carry on the practice of making Zal paper in Vietnam. And so I want to circle back to the initial question I asked before. How many paper plants have we chosen? And people are remarkably selective about what plants they are using. Only about 60 species do I have compelling evidence that they have been used or are currently used in making paper. And this includes about 40 species for true paper, where the fibers are distributed in a vat with water, and then about 20 species of amate, where the fibers are macerated directly on a board without much water. In addition, we have lots of plants that are used for their accessory purposes, including the beading mallets, the formation aids, the paper-making frames, paper-making screens, the dyes, bark cloth, pigments, etc. So I want to conclude this is my last talking slide. I want to conclude by sharing some botanical art by some botanists I know. Patty Chan is an instructor of botany. She's a PhD student at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And every day for lecture, she draws this in chalk on the blackboard. And then Erin O'Connell is a colleague from Tyson Research Center in Washington University in St. Louis, who makes these really incredible mandalas showing the different phenologies of plants at different times of the year that are native to Missouri. So I want to share, so I'm sharing this art, and this mastery often requires imagination as much as it does logic. So I am leaving you all with a reminder to learn with your hands and with your spirit, as well as your minds, such that your curiosity leads you to new conclusions, as well as new creations. Thanks.